Let's start with something most people get completely wrong about avoidance. They assume distance means disinterest. They assume silence means indifference. But what's really happening underneath is far more nuanced and far more human. An avoidant is not running from connection. They're running from the feeling of losing themselves inside it. So when we talk about emotional attachment for an avoidant, we're not talking about intensity. We're not talking about passion, constant communication, or emotional closeness in the way most people define it. We're talking about something much quieter, much more subtle, emotional safety without pressure. Because pressure, to an avoidant, doesn't feel like love. It feels like a loss of autonomy. Think about it. Every time someone says, "Why didn't you text me back? Where is this going? Do you really care about me?" Those questions may seem normal on the surface, but to an avoidant, they carry an emotional weight that feels intrusive. It's not the words themselves, it's what they imply. Expectation, obligation, demand, and the moment those enter the space, their nervous system shifts into defense mode. They don't lean in, they pull back. Now here's where it gets interesting. If pressure pushes them away, what draws them in? It's the absence of it. When you create an environment where they are not being evaluated, not being rushed, not being emotionally cornered, something inside them begins to relax. And when that relaxation happens, their guard, the very thing that blocks attachment, starts to lower. You have to understand, avoidants are constantly scanning for signs that they're about to lose control of their independence. So when they encounter someone who doesn't try to control them, doesn't try to define the relationship prematurely, doesn't react emotionally every time there's distance, it disrupts their expectation. It makes them pause. Because now, instead of feeling like they need to protect themselves from you, they start to feel safe with you. And safety is the gateway to everything. But let's be very clear. This is not about becoming passive or suppressing your needs. That's not strength. That's self-abandonment. What we're talking about here is emotional discipline. The ability to feel deeply without projecting urgency. The ability to care without creating pressure. There's a difference. When you operate from emotional discipline, your presence becomes calm, grounded, and non-invasive. You're not trying to extract validation. You're not trying to force clarity before it's ready. You're allowing the connection to breathe. And that breathing space is where an avoidant begins to do something rare. They start to come closer on their own, not because they were pushed, not because they were convinced, but because, for the first time, connection doesn't feel like a threat to their identity. It feels like a choice. And that's the shift most people never understand. Avoidants don't attach under pressure. They attach when they feel free enough to choose you, without fear of losing themselves in the process. So instead of asking, how do I get them to open up? A better question is, am I creating a space where they can open up without fear? Because the truth is simple but powerful. An avoidant doesn't attach to intensity. They attach to the person who makes connection feel safe. Let's dive into something that trips most people up when it comes to avoidance. They are unconsciously drawn to people who don't need them. And this is not some manipulative trick or a game. This is a psychological truth that comes straight from how their nervous system works. Avoidants are wired to protect their independence, their freedom, and the sense that they are in control of their own lives. The moment someone becomes emotionally dependent on them, something inside them clicks, and not in a good way. It triggers that ancient survival mechanism. Responsibility equals threat. Responsibility equals loss of freedom. And loss of freedom equals panic. Now, imagine you're in a relationship and the other person constantly seeks reassurance, constantly needs your attention, constantly leans on you to feel whole. For a non-avoidant, that may feel like intimacy, but for an avoidant, it feels like pressure. It feels like their autonomy is being invaded. And what does an avoidant do when they feel invaded? They retreat. Not because they don't care, not because they don't want connection, but because their psychology says, I need to protect my sense of self. Here's where the paradox comes in. The avoidant doesn't run from love. They run from neediness. They attach not to people who need them, but to people who are already whole, people who are emotionally self-sufficient, people who have cultivated a sense of inner security that is independent of them. And this is what most people miss. Attachment in avoidance isn't born from desperation or emotional intensity. It's born from the calm, grounded presence of someone who doesn't need constant reassurance, someone who is stable, someone who can hold themselves emotionally without leaning on them for validation. Think about that for a moment. The more you demonstrate that your happiness, your sense of self-worth, and your emotional well-being are intact without depending on them, the more magnetic you become. You're no longer an obligation. You're no longer a source of anxiety. You're a safe, intriguing presence. And safe, intriguing presence is exactly the combination that sparks desire in someone who fears losing themselves in connection. Now, this doesn't mean you suppress your emotions or hide your vulnerability. It doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. That would be disingenuous and ultimately unfulfilling. Emotional self-sufficiency is not about detachment. It's about mastery. It's about having the ability to feel deeply, express authentically, and maintain your sense of self without creating dependency. When you operate from this place, the avoidant sees something profoundly rare. Someone who is both accessible and untouchable. Someone who offers connection without threatening their freedom. Someone who chooses themselves first and still chooses them. This is why emotional self-sufficiency is so powerful. It flips the dynamic. Instead of chasing, instead of pushing, you naturally pull. Instead of trying to break down walls, you create an environment where the walls come down on their own. And that is the essence of attachment for an avoidant. It's never about neediness. It's always about safety, stability, and the subtle allure of independence. So when you reflect on your own relationships, ask yourself, am I leaning on them for my sense of self, or am I grounded enough to bring my whole, complete self into the connection? Because the avoidant doesn't attach to what you lack, they attach to what you embody. And here's the key takeaway. Emotional self-sufficiency is not selfish. It's magnetic. It's the foundation of every connection that lasts. When you become whole, they want to come closer. Not because they have to, but because they can. Be whole, be grounded, be magnetic, and watch them choose you. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. Let's explore a truth that almost nobody talking about avoidance gets right. Closeness doesn't create attachment, it can actually destroy it. Most people assume that the more attention, more intimacy, and more availability you give, the faster an avoidant will connect. And for a moment, that might seem true. But if you look closely at the psychology beneath it, you'll see the exact opposite is often the case. Avoidance attached through absence, not presence. Space, not suffocation, is the secret that makes them curious, reflective, and ultimately drawn to you. Think about it this way. Avoidants have spent a lifetime protecting themselves from overwhelm. Emotional intensity triggers their fight or flight system. The more you lean in, the more they unconsciously feel the walls of their autonomy closing in. So when you chase, when you hover, when you demand, their natural reaction is to pull back. And here's the kicker. They don't pull back because they don't care. They pull back because they need room to process, to breathe, to feel safe again. But when you step back intentionally, when you give them breathing room without panic, without drama, without guilt, you activate something rare and profoundly magnetic. That absence doesn't feel like rejection, it feels like freedom. And freedom is what an avoidant craves above all else. By creating space, you are telling them in the most subtle, powerful way, I'm here, but I don't need you to be mine. I trust you to come closer if you choose. And when they feel that trust, their curiosity is awakened. Their heart starts to question, do I want to risk staying away? This is the paradox. The less available you seem, the more they are drawn to you. Not because you're playing games or manipulating them, it's because you're demonstrating emotional maturity, self-control, and respect for their autonomy. You're showing them that connection doesn't have to feel suffocating, that closeness doesn't have to equal loss of self, that intimacy can exist on terms that don't threaten them. And when they see that, walls that have been built for years, even decades, begin to soften. It's also important to note that absence has to be natural, not punitive. Avoidance can detect manipulation instantly. If you withdraw to punish them, if you distance yourself out of anger or insecurity, they don't feel drawn. They feel validated in their fear. That intimacy equals danger. The power of space comes from calm, consistent presence that is balanced by autonomy. It's not scarcity, it's rhythm. It's a subtle dance of connection and detachment that mirrors the natural ebb and flow of life itself. The moment they experience this kind of space, something remarkable happens. They start noticing the little things they may have ignored. They begin to reflect on the quality of your connection. They start imagining what it would feel like to risk coming closer. And in this reflection, attachment is born. Not because they were pressured, not because you proved yourself, but because they finally choose it on their own. So if you're someone who's used to chasing, asking for validation, or overgiving, here's the challenge. Step back. Trust the rhythm of absence and presence. Allow them to feel the subtle pull of choice instead of the push of expectation. Because in that space, the avoidant begins to do something rare. They begin to desire you on their own terms. Step back, give space, let freedom do the work, and watch them come to you, not because you chased them, but because they chose to. Let's talk about a truth that most people completely miss when it comes to avoidance. Consistency matters, but clinginess destroys. It's a delicate balance, and understanding it is one of the keys to creating attachment in someone who's wired to protect their independence. Avoidants are incredibly sensitive to patterns. They notice shifts in behavior, energy, and attention in ways most of us can't even imagine. If you are unpredictable, hot and cold, or emotionally erratic, it triggers their defense system. They start bracing for emotional turbulence before it even arrives. But here's the nuance. Consistency doesn't mean you show up in a desperate, overbearing way. That's not consistency. That's obsession. True consistency is calm, grounded, and steady. It's the quiet knowledge that you are present, reliable, and emotionally stable without suffocating them with need. Think about it. If you act like a roller coaster, sometimes intensely available, sometimes distant, sometimes reactive, the avoidant brain immediately goes on high alert. It interprets your inconsistency as a potential threat. They don't feel safe. And when they don't feel safe, they can't attach. Attachment doesn't exist in chaos. It exists in rhythm. It exists in predictability, but predictability without pressure. That's the subtle art. You are consistent in your behavior, your values, your energy, your boundaries, but you are not pushing, prodding, or demanding. You are consistent because your presence is grounded in self-mastery, not insecurity. This is where most people fail. They believe being consistent means chasing relentlessly. They confuse attention with love, responsiveness with intimacy, and clinginess with caring. But avoidants don't want to be cared for in that way. They want to be respected. They want to know that your presence is available, but not dependent on their approval or validation. When you can consistently show up in that way, it creates a psychological anchor. They begin to understand, even subconsciously, that connection with you is safe, steady, and worth investing in. Consistency also signals trustworthiness. When an avoidant senses that someone is steady and reliable, they feel less pressure to constantly test the connection. They don't need to pull away to check if you'll abandon them. That is enormously magnetic. It's not flashy, it's not dramatic, but it's powerful. It tells them, I can show up as my authentic self with this person, and I won't be met with chaos or neediness. That realization opens doors that are otherwise locked by fear and avoidance. But here's the balance again. Too much consistency without boundaries, without space, becomes clinginess. Avoidants are allergic to being emotionally cornered. You can be consistent and steady, yet still allow for autonomy, yours and theirs. That means you are predictable in your values, predictable in your presence, predictable in your respect, but not predictable in a way that traps them or restricts their freedom. That is the difference between a connection that suffocates and a connection that magnetically attracts. So consistency for an avoidant is not about rigid schedules or constant check-ins. It's about emotional reliability, grounded energy, and integrity in action. It's about showing them that you are someone who doesn't destabilize their world, but who can exist alongside it fully, calmly, and confidently. That combination is rare. And when they encounter it, it draws them in. They begin to trust. They begin to wonder what it would feel like to be closer. They begin to attach. Not because you demanded it, not because you begged for it, but because you embodied a steady, reliable presence that they can depend on without fear. Be steady, be reliable, be consistent without clinging, and watch them come to you willingly, drawn by the quiet strength of your presence. Let's address something that trips most people up when it comes to avoidance. They are not incapable of emotional depth, far from it. The truth is, avoidants are profoundly sensitive, capable of feeling deeply, and able to form lasting bonds, but only under certain conditions. Most people misunderstand this. They assume that because an avoidant may resist vulnerability, they are shallow or uninterested. That's completely wrong. Avoidants don't avoid feelings. They avoid emotional chaos. Intensity, unpredictability, and drama are what trigger them to shut down. So if you want to create attachment, if you want them to feel drawn to you, the key is showing emotional depth without emotional volatility. Think about it. In the world of attachment, intensity is often confused with intimacy. People assume that if they can get someone to open up dramatically, if they can create emotional highs and lows, they are creating closeness. But for an avoidant, high drama feels like danger. Their nervous system interprets it as a threat. Emotional chaos triggers the same protective instincts that make them distance themselves from people in the first place. So when you try to pull them in with drama, overwhelm, or desperation, you aren't creating connection, you're reinforcing their walls. What does work, though, is emotional depth expressed calmly and clearly. Vulnerability doesn't have to be messy. It doesn't have to be reactive or impulsive. When you can show an avoidant that you are capable of profound emotion while maintaining clarity and stability, something shifts inside them. They start to realize that intimacy doesn't have to be a trap, that opening up doesn't have to equal loss of control, that they can feel safe in expressing themselves without losing their autonomy. This is where the power of non-chaotic depth comes into play. You can be expressive, authentic, and emotionally rich, yet not overwhelming. You can share your feelings, your insights, and your experiences in a way that invites them in rather than pushes them away. This demonstrates a rare balance, strength and softness coexisting. It communicates to an avoidant that connection can exist without threat, that closeness can be nourishing rather than suffocating. And when they perceive that possibility, attachment begins to form, not through force, not through drama, but through quiet, consistent depth. Another element to consider is the modeling effect. Avoidants are incredibly perceptive. They watch how you manage your own emotions. When they see you able to navigate your feelings without being consumed by them, they are subtly learning that they can do the same. Your calm, grounded, emotional depth becomes a mirror for them. It shows them that intimacy doesn't require losing themselves, that vulnerability doesn't require chaos. And this creates a safe pathway for them to explore their own feelings and ultimately to attach. The final piece is patience. Emotional depth with an avoidant is not a sprint. You can't force them to open up on your timeline, but by consistently demonstrating that you can feel deeply without losing control, that you can be vulnerable without drama, you create an environment where attachment can happen organically. They begin to trust that closeness is not a threat, that vulnerability is not a danger, and that connection can exist without overwhelming them. And once that trust is established, their walls start to soften and real intimacy emerges. So the lesson here is simple but profound. Avoidants respond to emotional depth that is steady, clear, and non-chaotic. Drama pushes them away. Calm depth draws them in. Show your depth without creating chaos, and watch them choose to come closer, not because they have to, but because they finally feel safe enough to. Now we arrive at the point where all the threads come together, the moment where you begin to understand why attachment for an avoidant is so rare and yet so achievable when approached correctly. I call this the rare three-part formula, and it's deceptively simple but profoundly effective. It's not about games. It's not about manipulation. It's about understanding the psychological architecture of an avoidant and aligning your presence in a way that feels safe, intriguing, and liberating all at once. The first part of this formula is freedom. Avoidants attach only when they feel they have the freedom to choose. Freedom is non-negotiable for them. When someone tries to control, pressure, or trap them, their instinct is to flee. It's hardwired. But when you give them space, when you respect their autonomy, when you show them that their choice to engage with you is entirely theirs, something remarkable happens. That respect for freedom is magnetic. It's paradoxical. The less they feel forced, the more they want to come closer. You see, an avoidant's heart is curious, but it only opens when it feels it's safe to explore without losing itself. Freedom signals that safety. The second part is challenge. Avoidants are not drawn to those who are easily conquered, who bend to meet every demand, or who immediately sacrifice their own identity for the sake of connection. That's not attractive. It's predictable. What draws an avoidant in is someone who is whole, self-assured, and unafraid to maintain boundaries. Someone who challenges them intellectually, emotionally, and even morally without being controlling. Challenge here is not about conflict. It's about being seen as complete, strong, and untouchable in a way that encourages admiration and curiosity. It's the magnetic tension that says, I am not yours to possess, but I am here willingly. And the third part is non-attachment. This is perhaps the most misunderstood element. Non-attachment doesn't mean indifference. It doesn't mean coldness or emotional distance. It means you operate from a place of inner security. You are choosing them, but you are not needing them. You bring your full self into the relationship, but you do not base your identity or your happiness on their actions or approval. This non-attachment communicates something profound to an avoidant. That connection with you is safe, balanced, and voluntary. It's not a trap. It's not a requirement. It is a choice, made freely, and that freedom is irresistible. When freedom, challenge, and non-attachment come together, they create something rare, a space where an avoidant can finally let down their walls. They feel safe to explore intimacy because their independence is respected. They feel intrigued because they are challenged and seen as worthy of effort. They feel secure because you are grounded, self-sufficient, and emotionally disciplined. In other words, you become psychologically magnetic, not through manipulation, but through mastery. This is why so few people achieve this kind of attachment with avoidance. Most either cling, chase, or overcompensate. They try to pull the avoidant in with pressure or overexpression, and the walls go back up. But when you embody this formula, attachment happens naturally. They do not feel cornered, they do not feel obligated, they feel drawn. They feel curiosity, trust, and respect. And that is where real emotional connection begins. So remember this, the rare three-part formula is not about tricks, it's about alignment. It's about being someone who honors freedom, embodies challenge, and practices non-attachment with clarity and confidence. When you do this consistently, the avoidant doesn't just tolerate your presence, they choose it, value it, and ultimately begin to attach to it in a way that feels safe, profound, and lasting. Give freedom, embody challenge, practice non-attachment, and you become the person an avoidant doesn't just notice, but chooses to stay with on their own terms. Let's bring this full circle, because everything we've explored tonight points to one profound truth about connection, about attachment, and about human psychology. Avoidants are not broken, and they are not incapable of love. They are wired to protect themselves from overwhelm, from chaos, and from loss of autonomy. And the reason attachment feels rare with them is because most people approach them the wrong way. They chase, they pressure, they cling. But when you shift your approach, when you create emotional safety, cultivate self-sufficiency, respect the power of space, embody consistency without clinginess, show depth without chaos, and live by the rare, three-part formula of freedom, challenge, and non-attachment, you unlock a truth that is rarely understood. Attachment is not forced, it is chosen. And when it is chosen, it is magnetic, enduring, and profound. Every key point we've covered is part of a larger principle. Connection grows where respect, maturity, and emotional intelligence exist. Avoidants respond to strength disguised as gentleness, to freedom framed as choice, to vulnerability expressed with calm. You are not manipulating them. You are modeling what healthy attachment looks like. You are demonstrating that intimacy doesn't require loss of self, that love doesn't require surrender, that closeness doesn't require chaos. So if there's one takeaway to leave you with, it's this. Attachment with an avoidant isn't about chasing, it's about embodying the qualities that invite them in on their own terms. Be grounded, be whole, be patient, and let freedom, challenge, and non-attachment guide your connection. When you do this, you don't just draw them near. You become unforgettable in a way that only authenticity and mastery can create. Connection, choice, and respect, that is the ultimate power. And that is how an avoidant truly attaches.